You're listening to the Menopause Movement podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Gordon. If you haven't taken advantage of the Menopause Movement beta course yet, sign up at menopausemovement.com/hormones. We offer this $500 beta course at no charge to you in exchange for feedback and testimonials. Now, we normally require a lengthy application to join the course, but because you're a podcast listener, you can skip the application, go straight to the front of the line and get started on the material. Now, if you've always wanted to understand your hormones and manage your menopause naturally, this program is definitely for you. We just simply ask for feedback and testimonials so that we can improve the course to help more women. Just go to menopausemovement.com/hormones to sign up for this program so that you can start to step out of that minnow muck that has kept you stuck. I'm excited to welcome Chris Reavis to the podcast today. Chris helps parents of autistic kiddos easily create a calm, predictable life with the best futures for their kids. He has a Harvard certification for this. He's one of 220 that have it, and he helps others as well as serving his own kids with this approach. He's an author, sought after speaker, and also has 30 years as a leader in the tech industry. He lives in the Pacific Northwest with his wife, 2 kids, and Penelope, the Wonder Dog. Now, some of you are still raising children, and some of you may find that applying these principles to your children or your grandchildren can change your relationships for the better. I sure wish I had these skills when my son was little, but it's never too late to start. During the podcast, we talk about Chris's story and how helping parents of different children became his passion. Talk about the definition of conventional parenting and how it doesn't really work with neurodivergent children, what a skill gap difference is and why that matters. Fight, flight, and freeze as a coping mechanism for your children. The importance of knowing the intention of your child and finding empathy for your child's situation in the moment. Your child's experience as a starting point for managing their behaviors. The role curiosity plays in getting to the bottom of your child's behavior. The importance of involving your child in the solution to the problem and how to do that. How to get your child to listen to you almost every time. And stay to the end to find out about the RAD protocol and how you can start applying this right now. At the end of the episode, visit drmichellegordon.com/podcasts, where you can find the show notes, plus the links to the books and resources mentioned in the episode. And if you enjoy the episode, subscribe to the podcast so you're always the first to know when each episode is released. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And please review the podcast. If you haven't yet, what are you waiting for? Take the time to review the podcast so that more women can find it. More reviews help more women find it and get the help they need during the disruption of menopause, because no one should have to go it alone. And thanks so much for being a part of the menopause movement. Now let's get to Chris. Chris, welcome to the Menopause Movement podcast. And you're one of a handful of men that we've had on this podcast. And I'm super excited to have you here today because many of us in midlife and menopause, we're done raising our kids, or, we may have had kids when we were older. And so we may have some preteens that we're dealing with and stuff.
Right.
And some of those preteens may have maybe on, what we call the spectrum, or, have some sort of learning disable or learning difference, or may think differently. And what I think is really valuable about what you offer is you help people to connect with their different child. And so what I'd like to do is if you could just give us a little bit of an introduction, tell us how you got into this, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me, and honor to be here. So I came about this in sort of a backwards way, and sometimes that's how all the best things in the world happen. I have a 30-year degree in technology, so doing IT and coding and that sort of thing, but I also have 2 kiddos on the spectrum, and going through figuring out, right, as a parent, you do everything you can to serve your kiddos and to create some certainty in their life and yours. And I came upon this approach, and I used it, and I used a bunch of other things that worked for me and my family. And I realized there's not really like a package out there that, hey, if your kid is on the spectrum, here's some things you can try with some known results. There's lots of things out there. There's lots of therapies and medications, but there's not like a full package or someone that says, oh, I get it, and let me help you out. So that's the first part. And if I may, just from a personal part, the reason I pivoted to this was I just grew up with a mom that taught me to serve people. And I feel best when I'm serving and helping people. And my mom passed a few years ago, but I feel it in my blood. I feel it in my hands, my heart when I'm doing this. So I'm like called to do it. And I've been able to get great results with the families I'm serving. So I'm just going to keep doing it.
Yeah, I love that. And it's really interesting because when we talk about purpose and menopause can be such a time of disruption and even I like to say maybe an existential crisis, at least it was for me and it is for a lot of the women that I serve. And for me, I left a pretty great career as a surgeon to start serving women in menopause and it's just so much more aligned with who I am. And so finding something that makes you feel aligned and something that you want to do every single day is so important to creating a life that you love. So I
Right.
think that's great. Yeah.
Thank you.
So let's talk about conventional parenting and what that means.
Yeah, totally. So most of us grew up with, and this isn't a beat up on the parents, everything was doing the best they could, but most of us grew up with what I'll call a punishment reward scheme or right or wrong, or if there's just more discipline and just more consistency, our kids would act better. It's just kind of
Mm.
like what we come with, right? It's just our family of origin tells us that's the way to parent. And what I learned, and I grew up with that too, and I love my parents and they meant well and they just did the best they could. But the science shows something very different, especially for kids on the spectrum or with
Mm.
ADHD. Their brains, they were just born with, I like to say the wheelchair's on the inside, you can't see it, but
Mm-hmm.
their coping skills are just different. It's a skill gap difference. And because of that, they'll go to fight, flight, freeze and kind of stay there. It's more difficult for them to get out of that. And what the brain shows, and what I learned from really smart people that know this, is when we're in fight, flight, or freeze, we're in a primitive brain, and our prefrontal cortex, where all the reasoning and problem solving and all that beautiful stuff happens, is off. It's like a light switch, and literally, there's no electricity there. So
Mm.
we're supposing as parents we can talk to that part, but it's off. And until we kind of meet them where they're at and build up their skills, they're not able to get to a place for us to use those techniques, right? That we know and love. So it's a couple like 2 millimeter shifts and how we approach our kiddos that give way better results than just this constant fighting or adversarial relationship.
I love that 2 millimeter reference. And I've heard that before. Plastic surgeons will say, I moved everything 2 millimeters and it makes you look so many years younger.
Sure.
And Tony Robbins uses it. And he talks
Oh,
about
okay.
2 millimeters and how a 2 millimeter shift can mean the difference in your life, in everything.
Yeah.
From a personal standpoint, my son was born normal, but then had radiation and chemotherapy at 21 months to save his
Mm,
life from a cancer. And I did not have the skills to parent him appropriately as his brain was then damaged by the treatment that kept him
mm,
alive. And it wasn't until, gosh, I would say he was in his 20s really that I had the communication skills to understand why he just wouldn't respond.
right.
And I remember I have a few years ago, we went to Provincetown in Massachusetts and we go there every year. We spend a couple weeks there at the end of the summer. And I remember we were standing outside of our restaurants before the pandemic. And I said to him, I said, honey, I said, I'm really, really sorry that I didn't have this skill set when you were a child because this does help. I mean, because he just gets to a point where he just, we say he gets his horns twisted.
Hmm.
And he's 27 years old now, but he's still growing up. And he gets his horns twisted, and it's just impossible to try and you can't reason with him. You can't get through to him. You just have to wait it out and just say, all right, come back when you've come through that.
Right.
And now that I've got that skill set, I don't take it personally. I know that he's just being him and doing the best he can with the
Right.
brain that he has, been gifted with. And so when it comes to autism and ADHD, what are the big differences? I mean, you have two kids who are on the spectrum. I'm sure
Right.
you've worked with parents who have kids who are on the spectrum and who aren't on the spectrum. And so what are the expectations? Because again, most of the time, most of the people who are going to be listening to this, most of the women who are going to be listening to this are probably not going to be having children that they deal with directly, but they're going to be dealing with grandchildren.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a few things. One is, and I think you said it so well, Dr. Gordon, it's not intentional, right? The kiddo's not trying to be defiant or any of those other things. And really, if you could see a picture of what's going on in their brain, they're probably petrified. It's probably a fear thing that's coming out as upset, anger, whatever those things are. And what the brain scans show is stressors come into this kiddo. They don't have the skills. So it's a skill gap. It's not a will gap. They don't have the skills to handle that stressor and they go to fight or flight and stay there. And it might not be a stressor you or I would experience, but for them, it's as much as a bear in the room, right? Or whatever that fight flight would be. And they can't naturally get out of it. It's not like telling a kiddo to get over it. They can't, or they would, right?
Mhm, mhm,
So what we've learned and what the protocol I work with shows is empathy, really meeting where the kiddo where they're at. So if they say Thor's in the room, instead of arguing with them or calling them a liar, or the things that we might do naturally as parents, or our go-to is, boy, that must be really scary to have Thor in the room. What's that like? And just
mm,
that little 2 millimeter shift and acknowledging that they really are experiencing Thor in the room, they're not lying to you, calms them down, calms you down as a parent. And then you can begin to, over time, build up that neural fabric. So they have, out of their 100 billion connections, 100 trillion connections they have in their brain, they can have a different path. Instead of fight, flight, freeze, they might have a way over time doing this empathy and having them solve their own problem. They're going to build resiliency that they wouldn't
mm.
normally.
Sure.
And traditional parenting just doesn't do that, right? It's not about building the kiddo up. It's a little bit more about right, wrong, and control versus how do we build resilience and how do we build the kiddo's problem solving capabilities.
Yeah, no, I love that. And children, as a general rule, right? It doesn't matter whether they have a neurotypical brain or a different brain.
Right.
They don't have the experience to filter their actual, whatever the trauma is or whatever the act is that they're in, whatever.
Right.
They don't have that experience. And then to see what it really is, and what we can do as adults, we can look back at an event that happened to us as a child and kind of reprogram our brains to make it not so traumatic, right?
Absolutely.
That's a great skill set to have as an adult. The problem is when it comes to somebody who has a learning difference or has a brain wiring difference, they need more repetition and they need safety.
Right.
And they need to know that no matter what they do, it's going to be safe. No
Right.
matter
And
what
they're
they do,
loved.
it's going to be
Yep.
safe. Yeah.
Yep.
And so where do you, so let's say I'm the parent or the grandparent of a child who throws a lot of tantrums because they
Right.
just don't understand their environment.
Yeah, the couple of things. The one is to get incredibly curious, pretend like you're a CSI investigator, and when does that happen? So go behind the behavior. The behavior we all notice, and that's easy to talk about. What's more important is get the antecedent or whatever that is, and super specific. Like, not my kiddo always does this, but like last night before dinner when we put the iPad away, something came up, right? Kind of that specific. And when we have the conversation with the child later, when it's not heated, it really should go something like this. Hey, buddy, hey, darling, whatever's natural for you. You're not in trouble. Can we talk about something? They say yes or no. And then you bring up the event, but not the behavior, because the behavior will be triggering and they can get, to your point, unsafe. And then we really hear them out. And sometimes there's nuggets of information here that we don't expect. I was working with a family this week. Their kiddos on the spectrum didn't want to go to the sporting activity that he's done a lot and is really good at. And the parent was wanting them to go because, this is a great opportunity and everything else. And they were able to get to empathy with the kiddo. And he just wanted to bring this lunchbox that was really special to him that he used to get to bring. That was the issue, right? And they wouldn't have gotten there likely with command control. We're going to do this or else. But just that little tiny shift and just spending a little time hearing him out, they discovered he wanted to bring his lunchbox. And they went skiing and had a great time.
That's so great.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I have tons of those little stories that it seems really simple. We just forget as parents sometimes that, just like you said earlier, we've got decades of coping skills and a fully formed brain, and our
Yeah.
kiddos just aren't there yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's really good. And how do you deal with the parent who is freaking out because they're late and the kid won't get dressed or the kid won't,
Yeah.
do what needs to happen in a certain amount of time, and then they're going to be late to work and
Yeah.
all of those things. And these are real stressors. These are
Oh
real.
yeah.
Yeah.
And morning routine and night routines or any
Yeah.
routines are a big deal. So the first thing I do when I work with parents is help them understand what the lagging skills inventory is and just help them get the mindset on it is hard. It's exhausting as a parent to do this. So just giving them empathy as well, but also walking them through here are the lagging skills that are there and helping them be aware of that it's a skill gap, not a will gap. And then helping them understand how to structure a conversation with their kiddo about this. in a way that's non-threatening, in a way that really gets everything out there, and then
Sure.
having their kiddo solve the problem. And again, you have to agree on what that solution is, but building up that fabric for your kiddo is huge. And usually what we do are these punishment reward charts. And if you do this 5 times, great, you get a smiley face. And it's all well intentioned, but the gotcha is for neurotypical kids, that's relatively easy. For kids on the spectrum, there's studies that show they'll just being presented that they'll freak out because
Hmm.
they know they can't get there naturally yet. They don't have the skill yet built up to get there. And so they'll get really sad because they're trying really hard. That's the trick, is I think we assume as parents they're not trying.
Yeah.
And it's quite the opposite. They're probably trying harder than some kids. They just aren't able to get there yet. So, there's no silver bullet solution here, but hearing the kiddo out, going after the problem to be solved and not the behavior, and having them solve that problem that's agreeable, just that pattern pretty quickly changes the whole dynamic. And some
Yeah.
of that too is you might soften your parental expectation. You might, maybe the teeth can be brushed on the way to school in the car. Maybe there's some little things like that that you're willing to give on, because really you want peace in your family. You want that thing done. You want to be able to get to work. But you may need to loosen up some of those parental expectations just a little bit.
Yeah, that's really good. And it's really funny because one of the things that I stumbled across with my son was, and what I've told people who've worked with him, I mean, he lived in an assisted living facility until the pandemic, and then I brought him home
Mhm.
because he's got some medical issues and I just wanted to take care of him. But one of the things I would say to the staff at the facility was like, look, it has to be his idea. If it's not his idea, he's not going to take any action.
Right.
And so when I took a questions based approach with him.
Mhm.
So why, what caused you to do this, and what can you change in the future, or what is the next step, or what is something that you can do, or how can you then then he almost always comes to a solution that works for everyone.
Awesome.
And that was a big change for us. And the other thing is that trying to get underneath his motivation, and he's been home since March, and he had a lot of free reign. He would, go walking a couple miles every day and whatnot. And he was sleeping a lot. I mean, just he was sleeping a lot. So we said, well, maybe
Mm.
he's depressed. And so my wife says, let's get him a personal trainer and have him work with a personal trainer a few times a week. And out of that, now he's like, I'm getting stronger and I feel better. And he puts it on his calendar. It's something to look forward to. And so I think it's really important that just like us,
Yeah.
we need things to look forward to. We have to help our children find those things that light them up and help them look forward to life, right?
Yeah. Very well said. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you put in your outline here that how to get how to always have your kids listen to you, which I think is like that's even though there may not be, when it comes to parenting, a different child, there may not be any one size fits all answer. If you're saying how to always get your kids to listen to you, this could be the magic bullet for just about any parent.
Well, yeah, I promise it'll move the dial, right? And
Yeah.
it's like the number one thing I get asked by parents is my kid won't listen to me. So for any human being, we have in general 3 ways that we like to learn. And we'll have a primary way and then some secondaries. And those are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Most education, even with online, is auditory. Most valedictorians are auditory, not a surprise. Most kids on the spectrum, if you look at the data, tend to be kinesthetic. They like to learn with their hands, they move around, or visual. They like to see something happen first or have a very precise order, A, B, C, D, and they can't go A to Z. So it's very difficult if we're visual or kinesthetic. Someone's talking at us, even another adult, we're basically creating a picture in our head or movements in our body to translate that, and then we can make meaning of it. So there's a
Hmm.
lot of work going on that's there. And one, just simple things, again, that 2 millimeter thing. If your kiddo's kinesthetic, which my son is, if I gently put a hand on my son Cooper and say, hey, buddy, can you do da da da? That's a totally different result than yelling across the room, hey, can you put water on the table for dinner? And it's because I'm honoring and knowing what his learning modality is, which is kinesthetic. And it's just simple. I don't have to, hand motion words out to him, but he'll hear it much, much more. So part of it's meeting your kiddo where they're at, knowing their learning
Hmm.
modality, and their language gives it away, or their behavior. If your kiddo says, I see what you mean, big Q, I hear what you mean. Auditory is easier in the sense that we normally give commands and request auditory. And kinesthetic, it's tough when kids are younger because they all are wiggle worms. But if the kiddo's wiggling a lot or moving a lot or likes to do Legos an awful lot and can do that and talk, that's kind of a cue. I've seen magic with my own family and others, just like the hand on the back or whatever is natural or comfortable with the kiddo. Them responding way more. And it's a comfort to them. If you're kinesthetic, having touch like calms you down and it helps you get in a comfortable state. So that's it. The other part is just the empathy part, is making sure we're hearing our kiddos out and really knowing where they're at. So I guess that's a fourth, but done together, almost, 70 to 80% improvement in all the families I've served by just those little tweaks.
That's amazing. So how does this, so let's say I'm, I've got a chaotic home. My kids, I'm always yelling at my kids or whatever, and I can't get them to do anything.
Yeah.
What is my first step to try and, calm this down and get some control over my life and stop having, modeling this behavior that I really don't even want them to have?
Yeah, that's great. Boy, in a nutshell, I mean, the first part, and I've been there in my past, at least partially, is just knowing that you don't want it to be that way. So, I mean, acknowledging that I don't want to feel angry and upset at my kids all the time, and there's got to be something different, and choosing a different path. I think it's getting educated on what works for you as a parent. And I wouldn't be as arrogant to say, like, my approach, there's many approaches that work out there that work with your family. So you've got to identify with what gels with you. But I would suggest there's lots of great books out there, but really knowing how the brain works at a super high level, all your senses come in and your reticular activating system routes things and you have an amygdala, just like the basics of that. So you know what you're working with right on the other side.
Right. Well, so what do you think is the best starter book for something like that?
Oh, wow. When things are that contentious, because it takes steps to get there, right? It's calming things.
Comes to the brain to understand.
Yeah, for the brain, I like the book Changeable by Dr. Stuart Ablon.
Okay.
He's from Harvard. He's the chair of child psychiatry there. It's really practical. It's an Audible. There's some really fun examples in there too. For those that read it, the tinfoil example is one of my favorites in the beginning.
Okay.
There's a patient that wanted to wear a tinfoil on his head. He was dealing with a bunch of issues, so the FBI wouldn't put ideas in his head. And instead of arguing and fighting with him, they let him do that under a ball cap. And he went to every session, he went to medication, he got his meds and he got better because they met him where he was at. He was afraid of this. Instead of telling him wrong, you shouldn't be afraid, that's not true. Let's just pretend it's true for a moment for him, right? And let's help him out. And then he got help.
So I think that's really important, even for us, to look at how belief shapes our reality. And that if I believe that putting tinfoil under my cap is going to make me better, then that's what's going to make me better.
Right. Yeah.
And eventually, and eventually I may get to a point where I don't think that, but I think it's so important because we start to develop beliefs about our environment, probably starting around age 4. And because of the nature of how things work, we interpret, especially as little children, we interpret events as our responsibility. So my parents got divorced, that's my fault.
Right.
My mom died, that's my fault. My mom spanked me because I spilled milk. There's just so many things. And then what happens is, and this happens to neurotypical people too, we just pile these beliefs on. And then before we know it, we've got these sentences that repeat in our heads that say, I'm bad, I'm no good, I can't do this, I have to ask permission, all these things. And so if this is how a neurotypical brain works, imagine when somebody has a different wiring, right? That they have to go from, instead of going from A to B, they may go A to D to B to not, to 9.
Right. Right.
And so it's, I think that's where it's so important for us to have empathy. But what do you do for those parents whose children may not be that communicative and they can't talk back to you?
It's more challenging. And that's a part where I would hand that off to someone else that's way more skilled, right? If they're nonverbal, that's a whole different tactic. I do know people that work in the Children's Hospital here in Oregon, where I am, that are super skilled at that. And they can use visual cues and a variety of other things. And I think too they do quite a bit of work to make sure there's not something physical with their ears as well, because
Hmm.
sometimes they're together. So I don't have any, most of the families, actually all the families I work with, their kiddo can communicate at least some
Okay.
verbally or give feedback visually with what's going on. So that's not a skill I'm super skilled at, but I know
Hmm.
folks who are.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's awesome. So, all right. So now we've got awareness of our state, and we know that
Yeah.
this isn't what we want.
Yeah.
But we're still in this situation where the kids aren't doing what we're asking.
Right.
And so, what's our next step? Now
So
we're aware of what we want.
the protocol that I use, I call it the RAD protocol. So the first part is empathy, and if we do nothing else, we stay in empathy. A lot of folks want to get to the finish line and get to the end and get the results, and you have to be careful with the brain, because you really want to meet your kiddo where they're at, get them
Hmm.
out of that fight or flight, and then you can have the conversation around problem solving. So lots of microdoses of empathy and getting really curious about when these events are happening, and focus on the event, not the behavior. And then there's three choices. There's what's called plan A. So that's really your command control, my way or the highway. There's a place and time for plan A that's healthy. When your kid's jumping out of a window, you're going to grab them, right?
Hmm.
When kids are really young, we do a lot of that. Don't touch the fire, right? So there's no good, bad, right, wrong. But in general, our percentage of planning as parents is probably bigger than is going to move us forward. Plan B is where you do that empathy state. You make sure the child feels known and understood, and then you share your parental concern, which is really short. This is a thing where parents, we don't talk much, we don't talk over our
Hmm.
kids. So it's, my concern is safety, my concern is, kind of one or two words, and then the kiddo solves the problem. So, hey buddy, you understand what's going on for me, I understand what's going on for you, how do we solve this? And they'll have some really wild ideas, which you just acknowledge and smile, and you agree on what the one is to solve. But that pattern done over time has lasting results. It does
Hmm.
build up the resiliency in the kids. It does build up the fabric. Parents will calm down. The last plan, there's A, B, and there's C. C is if something's really hot, we're not in our right minds, the kiddo's not in the right mind. It's not the time to solve it, right? You're not going to resolve in that state, neither is your kid. So you sideline it. You make a conscious strategic choice. This isn't a pushover and get away with. It's, hey, this isn't okay, but we're going to talk about it tomorrow, just like that. And one thing that does build relationship. You're acknowledging that something's happening and you're going to talk about it later instead of blowing up. And that gives a skill to your kiddo too. Like if something's really overwhelming to them, they don't have to deal with it right that moment, right? They now have a pattern where they can sideline that and come back to it. And for kids on the spectrum, that's hard. It's all at once, all the time. A lot of times there's RAS damage where, like, you walk in a crowded coffee shop and you experience the espresso machine and all the people and the music and all the noise at once as a wall. And that's hard, right? I could not imagine what that's like, but that's very true for kids on the spectrum and ADHD is their filter's not quite working. And so it's a wave that hits them all at once.
Hmm.
Right. So as we're empathetic, we learn that we know it's not intentional, and we find ways to kind of help build that skill up. Like maybe for me with my son, he squeezes my hand 3 times. That's what we worked out. And it's his idea when he's afraid. So he doesn't have to be embarrassed that he's afraid with his friends around. He can just grab my hand and squeeze it 3 times and we can do something, right? Instead of
Yeah.
him
No,
fearful of blowing up.
that's amazing. And so now he's in control of the situation,
Right.
and he's come to you that to someone he trusts to say, help me.
Right. Right.
And I love
Which,
that.
yeah, I wish as a neurotypical person, I wish I had that skill as a kid, right? Oh, I
Right,
can
for
go for
sure.
help.
Right, yeah. So what role do you think things like this play in
Oh, the spinning toys?
yeah, there's the fidget spinner.
Yeah,
So for
I
anybody
don't.
who's watching,
Yeah, they're probably overdone. And I feel sorry for the teachers that had those in their classrooms. But at the same time, kids on the spectrum and kids that need to move and wiggle, like, how do we accommodate that and have that be okay in a way that's not distracting to other kids, right? And that's a difficult one in a big classroom when you have 40 kids and everyone's trying to listen and do that. I don't know that that's the best tool. I guess that's my short answer in this
okay.
case of a classroom, right? Because it can distract other kids. But there's other things like clay or weighted blankets or other things that aren't as distracting that acknowledges that kiddo needs something to do. But I do, I guess it's really looking at the kiddo and the situation and what makes sense.
Yeah.
Instead of yet another device, right?
Yeah, I like that. But the problem I have with the rampant diagnosis of ADHD
Yeah.
in America, especially in America's children, is that, kids need to move. Kids need
Right.
to run their energy out. And, if you watch a child from I would say about 2.5 until they're about 5, everything is, well, why is that? And what's this? And the
Right.
explosion of language. But then on top of that, there's just all this wiggly stuff that they do. And
Yeah.
then we try and take them to teach them how to work at a factory.
Right. Exactly
And
right.
that's the problem I have with the American, the American method of education, and why my son, when he was younger, I had him in Montessori because those
Sure.
kids at least get to do whatever they want, and they get to choose what kind of education they have and stuff. And just bothers me that what we're trying to do is teach our children how to follow a factory schedule
Yeah.
when factory jobs are really not even there much anymore.
That's a great point. Yeah. Sit
Yeah.
still and listen and behave and all plan A type stuff in those 3 plans. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the best types of education are the ones where children get to make choices along the way. And of course, we've got to teach them things, that there's basic things that people have to learn. But gosh, at the same time, I mean, why do we have to teach them to respond to a bell? And why do we have to
Right.
ask permission for everything? Just to be able to relieve our bodies of excess,
Right.
solids and liquids. I mean, it's crazy.
It is.
It really is. And so I don't love that about it. So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about before we end this is,
Mhm.
you put in your outline here, remember how old kids are and their capabilities. And can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, and you, I think, alluded to it just a little bit earlier,
Yeah.
is we're born with about 86 billion neurons, and over until as we go from 0 to 25, we grow our connections. So we have the same number of brain cells, same number of neurons, but we go to about 100 trillion connections. But we don't have those all at age 5 or 6. And as you talked about earlier, if we remember back when we were 5 or 6, there were some things that were really scary or frightening or exciting then that aren't now. And we can forget that as adults. We have decades of coping
Mhm.
skills. We have a fully formed brain most days, and we're relating to our kiddos like they're another adult. Versus, my job is to build up my kiddo and also acknowledge where they're at. And this isn't, some parents, and especially men in general, will go to, I'm losing my control, which is not accurate, but that's a fear that
Yeah.
particularly men will have for whatever reason. I'm not sure why we have this culture of anger in the men, but I was guilty of that too. But it's not that, right? It's you want to build your kid up and have them be successful for life and be
Mhm.
super resilient. And if they're that way, you're not going to have the fights that you're having now, because those are about different things. Those are about command control, right, wrong, and everyone loses in those. Versus, I'm building you up, and you're going to have resiliency, and you're probably not going to have the issues you had. So there are all these different stages of development. Kids on the spectrum, kids with ADHD can look like they're a few years younger in their socialization through no fault of their own. It's just a skill set. But educationally, they may be really far along. And that's why it's awkward, because it'll look like it's a smart, quote unquote, normal kid. And then there's a blow up.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's just remembering that's going on. It's remembering their age. Like, what were you doing when you're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, if you can even remember, and what scared you, and kind of starting there. Like, take 30 seconds and like, oh, okay, at 9, I was afraid of riding a bike and swimming because these things happened. And they were really small things and I got over it. But those were scary then. And so if my
Mhm.
son who's 9 is scared about something, maybe it's not the same, but I can relate a little bit and go, oh yeah, that was a freak out moment at 9. I thought I was going to explode, right?
Yeah, it's
Versus,
it's so funny. I think that it's important for us to remember that humans don't come with an instruction manual, and we
nope.
have we have this whole, like, part of us that is feeling, and we are never taught, unless we have really really competent parents. We aren't taught what that means to have feelings.
Right.
And the feelings are really what's going to help to drive our behavior, because we want to move toward what feels good and move away from what feels bad. And
Yep.
so, if we can understand that when our child is tantruming, it's because they're really trying to move towards something that they feel good about and they're not getting their way,
Right.
or they're trying to avoid something that's bad, I think that can help us with our empathy.
It's a great point. Yeah, it's and most times, just like you said, it's really often the kid is scared to death about something. It comes out as
Yeah.
anger or upset, or whatever, but they're in a fearful state usually in that fight, flight, or freeze, and don't know how to get out of it and don't know how to tell you yet.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly right.
And that's our role, right? As the coach, the parent/coach,
Right.
to kind of help them to see what's going on and say, well, try and get them into some feeling words.
Right.
And what that does to us is it makes us really have to acknowledge and confront our own feelings and maybe even some of our
Right.
own fears as children,
Yep.
as we were growing up.
Yep. And just like you said, they're not a factory worker in your house either, right? They're
Yeah.
a lovely human being. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So was there anything else you were hoping to share today?
No, this was great.
Yeah, all right.
I'm really excited about this work and how successful it's been. And anytime in my own life, I catch myself, like if I'm getting angry or upset, or there's some really, I'll call it gnarly events this week in our world, it reminds me, if event or stressor happens that I don't know how to deal with, and I kind of freak out, or I'm sad, or I clam up, I'm like, that's exactly what my kiddo is going through.
Yeah.
Right. And so what works when I'm in that state is someone being caring and hearing me out, or doing something physical or drawing or whatever. I'm like, well, of course that's what the kiddo needs. Right. And we just forget that we have all these coping skills until something blows up. And we're like, what do I do?
What is it? What is it? Mike Tyson says everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
Right.
But it's so important for us to understand that the awareness is this first step. And so if the awareness is the first step to any sort of behavior change. And so it's
Right.
really important for us to, as we're trying to change our behaviors to change the behaviors of our children, we have to treat ourselves with empathy and respect too, and not get down on ourselves for falling back into old behaviors. Because remember how the brain works, the brain wants consistency, and it's
Right.
going to move toward those things that we always think about. And sometimes when we want to change, what we have to do is change the sentence in our head. And that starts with us, especially if we have a special child.
Right.
So where can people find you?
youfromhome.com is my website.
YOU?
youfromhome.com.
Great.
You'll find me on Instagram and Twitter as well, if you look for that, and Facebook.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate you being a part of the menopause movement today.
Hey, it's my honor. Thanks so much.
Right.
Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Did you know that menopause is not a medical condition? Most doctors don't know this either. I like to say that menopause is the privilege of a long life. And to really take hold of our lives in menopause, we have to unlearn what society and the medical establishment has told us about menopause. This is why I've created this brand new course called Understanding Your Hormones and Managing Your Menopause. I want to show you how you can get on top of your menopause right now so that you can start to see it as the best time of your life. Now, this course is valued at $500 and is in the beta testing phase. And we're currently accepting applications for women to test it out for us at no charge in exchange for feedback and testimonials. But the best part is, because you're a podcast listener, you can bypass the application process and go straight to the front of the line. To register right now, simply visit menopausemovement.com/hormones, and we can get started together right now. Remember, you can get started right now at no charge to you in exchange for feedback and testimonials when you go to menopausemovement.com/hormones. And I'll see you inside the course. Thanks so much for being a part of the menopause movement.